Hey guys! So before we really get started with some of our English 1 content, I wanted to walk you through some of the terms that you probably learned in 8th grade. What I want you to do is I want you to finish watching this video to kind of refresh your memory, and then at the end, you're going to submit examples into Thrivist, okay? So let's start reviewing. I'm going to minimize this. All right, the first term you may be familiar with is a narrative. So a narrative is what we're going to be working with for most of our stories, okay? So a narrative is a story or an account of events, experiences, or the like, whether it's true or fictitious, all right? Which fictitious is just fiction, all right? It means it's not true. So an example of a narrative is literally any story. It can be a TV show, it can be a novel, it can be a story that your mom and dad used to read to you before you went to sleep. So, narrative is a very, very wide range of text that you can read. Okay. The next term that you may be familiar with is called internal conflict. So, there are two types of conflicts that you studied last year in 8th grade. There was internal conflict, and then there was external conflict. Internal conflict is just a struggle that happens within the mind of the character. So it's kind of like the good angel and the bad angel on your shoulder. Should I do this or should I do this? Okay. It is within the own character's mind, though. A quick way to kind of remember the difference between internal and external is to look at the word internal. What does it mean when things are internal? It means that it's on the inside. Okay, so an internal conflict is a conflict that's happening within a character's mind. Now, an external conflict is a struggle between a literary or dramatic character that happens by an outside force. So you may be familiar with external conflicts being called man versus man, man versus technology, man versus society, man versus environment. Lots of different types of external conflict. But an external conflict just means that one character is having some type of problem that's happening outside of themselves, whether that is a guy punching another guy, which would be man versus man, or a guy that's stuck in the middle of a tornado, which is man versus environment, or a man who can't get his skyward to open. That's man versus technology. Okay, so external conflicts, anything that happens on the outside. External, so think of the word exit. A next concept that we're going to be talking a lot about this year is called irony. Now, there's 3 types of ironies. There's situational, dramatic, and verbal. We're going to go into each of those in a little bit more detail because they each kind of mean something a little bit different. Okay. Now, we'll wait to go over irony until we start reading a text to show those 3 things. But a quick review is situational irony is when one thing happens, but you expect the other. So, for example, a fire truck being caught on fire. You wouldn't expect that to happen. Or a police station getting robbed. Not something you would expect to happen. Dramatic irony is just when something happens in the story that the character doesn't know when the audience does. A good example of dramatic irony is just think about any scary movie. Okay, so scary movie, we know that the crazy killer is upstairs hiding in the bathroom. And where does the character go? Upstairs, wants to go into the bathroom. We, as the audience, we know, don't go in the bathroom. There's somebody bad in there. The character doesn't know that. That's what makes it a good story. And then verbal irony. It's one of my favorite types of irony is basically just sarcasm. Okay, so verbal irony is when somebody says one thing but they actually mean the opposite. So imagine somebody saying, man, that's a great haircut after you just got a really, really bad cut from your mom. That's verbal irony. The person that said that, they want you to know that they did not mean that they actually had a good haircut. They were being sarcastic. Authors use all 3 types in writing. William Shakespeare is actually a perfectionist when it comes to using all 3 types of irony, especially dramatic irony. All right, the 2 next terms are called connotation and denotation. Connotation is just when there's an emotional association with a word. Okay, and this makes a word positive or negative, even though they mean the same thing. So look at the chart I have for you. So one way that you can say something positive is we bought an inexpensive souvenir at the amusement park. That's a pretty positive statement, right? That's great, you saved money. But if I said we bought cheap souvenirs at the amusement park, that doesn't sound too good, right? Because cheap, oh, it's going to break. It's going to be terrible. It's not worth anything. Inexpensive and cheap kind of mean the same thing. But because the connotation, we interpret that information differently. Let's look at the next example. I ate a moist sandwich. Sounds pretty good. I ate a soggy sandwich. Doesn't sound too good. Moist and soggy, what do they mean? They mean that they're wet. But it's the connotation that makes one sandwich sound better than the other one. And then let's look at the last one. I'm a bargain shopper. It's very positive. Yeah, that's awesome. You're saving money. Versus I'm a cheapskate. All right, that's like you're really greedy with your money. Bargain and cheapskate basically mean the same thing. You don't like to spend a lot, but it's the connotation of those words that show you the difference. Then you have denotation. Denotation is a very easy concept. It's just the literal definition of a word. All right, there is no connotation. It is fact. In fact, this is what it means. Now, the next few slides are going to be talking about different forms of literary devices. All right, and you guys have probably been practicing these since you first started in middle school. All right, the first type is an alliteration. So the definition of an alliteration is just two or more stressed syllables of a group word, either with the same consonant sound or the same group of sounds. So a good example for alliteration is just Sally sold seashells by the seashore. It's very tricky for me to say too. Or the Peter Pepper picked a peck of pickled peppers. All right, all of those are alliterations. All right, the how much would check. It is just when you have a cluster of words or sounds that are repeated back to back. Okay, that is one type of figurative language. Another type of figurative language would be a simile. Okay, so a simile is when an author makes a comparison between two unlike things, but this comparison uses like or as. So, for example, you can say, her smile is like the sun. All right, that's comparing a smile on somebody's face to the sun, which is in the sky. Two very different things. What is that teaching you? It's teaching you her smile is bright, it's warm, it's inviting. The author didn't tell you those things, but that simile inferred those things for their audience. Now, a metaphor, the same thing as a simile, except it takes two words out. A metaphor is a comparison between two unlike things that does not use like or as. Okay, so, for example, her smile is the sun. So just to take a moment, think about how much stronger of a comparison that is versus to say her smile is like the sun. To say her smile is the sun, that is a very, very strong statement. Shakespeare uses this a lot in his own writing when he's comparing his beautiful protagonist for his reader. All right, so metaphors are often used to add a little bit more depth and meat to a comparison when an author really wants the audience to know and to kind of imagine this figurative world that they're painting. All right, so simile is like or as, metaphor is definite. And then we have personification. So personification is a pretty easy concept because it looks like it has the kind of the hint in the word person. So personification is a figure of speech in which a thing, an idea, or an animal is given human attributes. Okay, so this is when something that is not alive becomes alive in the words. So for example, the wind danced through the mountains. Can wind dance? No, only people can dance, right? But the author is using that to kind of paint the image of what they're wanting you to think. The wind is moving in different directions around the mountains. Kind of adds a lot of beauty to the words. You can also say something like, the sun laughed on my face. The sun doesn't laugh, right? The sun doesn't have a voice. but it's the same concept. Authors use personification to kind of add depth and a lot of richness to their writing. Okay, so personification, giving a non-human, human-like qualities. Next is point of view. So point of view is simply just a mode of narration. All right, and this is what the author employs to let the readers kind of hear and see what takes place in the story. You guys are probably most familiar with this being called first person, second person, or third person. First person is very easy to recognize. It's just when they're saying I think, I want, I feel. All right, first person, what that does for the reader is that's a really, really clear picture of what that main protagonist in the story is thinking, feeling, seeing, hearing, tasting, all of the imagery. Second person, we typically don't see this too much unless you're reading more informational essays. But that is when you're saying you, we, things like that. Third person, we will see frequently as first person. Third person is when things are taking place outside of the character's perspective. So that means he, she, they. There's no first person saying, I see this, but the reader is saying, she sees this, he sees this, they see this. It's not necessarily the same mode of transportation for the words as first person, but it can still just be as powerful as first person though. So authors are very particular when they pick which point of view that they're wanting their reading to come across for their audience. All right, and then we have our protagonist. You'll hear me use this word very frequently in this class. So protagonist oftentimes is taught to be good guy versus bad guy. That's not true. Protagonist is just the main character of a literary work. Sometimes the main character can be the bad guy. So think about the movie Deadpool or Maleficent. Maleficent is not the hero of the story, but she's the protagonist because she's the main character of that work. So for example, Simba, all right, from The Lion King, he's the protagonist of the story. The story is centered around Simba and his character. Now, the opposite of a protagonist is an antagonist. Now, again, this isn't a good guy versus a bad guy. A lot of times, students think that antagonist just means that they're bad. That's not necessarily true because an antagonist just means that they are against the protagonist. But if the protagonist is bad, then the antagonist would be the good guy. Typically in literature, we see protagonists as being good and an antagonist being bad. So it's not necessarily false all of the time. But I want students to be able to understand that an antagonist is just anything that opposes the protagonist. Sometimes this isn't even a person. Sometimes this can be the environment. So think about Castaway. If any of you guys have seen Castaway, a very short synopsis of that story is a man is basically on a deserted island in the middle of nowhere. The environment is the antagonist of that story, right? It's not, there's no other character on the island with him, but he does have an opposition, and that's the environment that he's in. So an antagonist is just anyone that is kind of competing with the protagonist in the story. So for Lion King, that would be Scar. Scar is a great example of an antagonist. All right, our next and probably one of our most important terms would be theme. Okay? So a theme is the main subject that is being discussed in a piece of writing. Okay? So a theme is basically what you are supposed to learn at the end of the story. So think back to kindergarten. You're all excited. You're doing carpet time, and your teacher's reading you the children's story, right? And then at the end, she closes the book and she says, "What did we learn, children?" She was teaching you guys theme. That's what a theme is. You guys all have heard about theme before. You maybe just didn't put that term with it. So a theme is just, what did the author want you to know at the end of the story? Did they want you to know that love is blind? Did they want you to know that good conquers evil? Did they want you to know to be nice to others? Did they want you to know that, the quest for power is tricky? Now, what do they want you to learn when you got finished reading that text? That is the theme. The theme is one of the most important things to be able to decipher when you're reading a narrative text, because that's why the author wrote it. Right? The author always is trying to teach a bigger theme in the writing, and that's what we have to do as the audience, is we have to figure it out. That's something in English 1 we worked really hard to kind of walk you through how to determine the theme, how that theme was developed. All right, then the next is author's purpose. So author's purpose is the reason why an author decides to write on a specific topic. Okay, so this is typically seen as pie. Sometimes teachers can teach it as pie, but I like to teach it as piece, okay, because there's a little bit more depth, especially now that we're in high school. Okay, so is an author trying to persuade you of something? So, for example, think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. He was trying to persuade his audience to listen to the civil rights movement, right? That was his goal with writing that speech. So his purpose was to persuade them. And then you have inform. So if somebody's just trying to inform you of information, this is most likely seen in a news article, right? They're not trying to get you to think A or B. They're just trying to give you information. A lot of science textbooks are the same thing, just information, right? This right here with me and you, this is I'm informing you of these review terms. E is entertain. All right, so typically when authors are wanting to entertain you, this can be found in leisure novels, this can be found in every Netflix series, this can be found in most movies as well. Something to remember, and something I like to tell my students, that the movies and TV shows, those are also text. Those are written out. So if you really like TV and you think that you don't like movies, basically the same thing. An author had to write those words in order for those actors to act that on the Netflix show. So you actually are a pretty good reader. You're just reading in a different way, right? But in those shows, their purpose is to entertain you. They want their audience to like the show, to enjoy the show, right? C stands for compare. You're just comparing two things. So, for example, if I am wanting to look at my English 1 class versus my English 2 class, and I have all of these charts and data of how they did on a test. Okay, I'm comparing one class to another class, and that is my purpose. Or to express. All right, express is when the author doesn't really care necessarily how you feel after reading their text. They wrote the text in order to help relieve themselves. So kind of think about this as a poetry. All right, a lot of times poets will write these poems to kind of express how they feel, and then we take that and we kind of learn a lot about them and their perspective. Okay, so expressing is another thing that authors can use in order to write a text. All right, and then you have perspective. So perspective is a really cool concept because it's basically just how an author's relationship or personal experiences influences their writing. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of this. One of the authors that I love my students to read is Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe had a really, really hard life. He had a lot of trauma at a very young age. He suffered with abuse. He lost a lot of his family members very early on. And he had a really, really hard childhood. So, what does he write? He writes really scary stories. But a lot of that horror that he writes about is kind of his perspective that he grew up with. Right? A lot of what happened in his childhood we can see reflected in his writing. If he didn't have such a traumatic childhood, would he have written all of these horror stories? Maybe not. Maybe he would have written all these beautiful love stories if he fell in love a lot. Or maybe he'd write about, I don't know, lots of different things. Okay. But because he had such a traumatic childhood, we kind of see that reflected in his writing. Okay, so perspective is very, very important. We're going to see this with Harper Lee when we start reading To Kill a Mockingbird. So definitely keep this on the back of your mind. But this is always something that you should be looking for when you're looking at how an author wrote and why the author wrote something. All right, and then you have dynamic character. Okay, so a dynamic character is just a character that undergoes some type of change in the story. Okay, this can be a physical change, but it's typically always referring to a personality change. Okay, so let's refer back to Simba. Simba did undergo a pretty big change, right? At first, he was scared. He wasn't willing to take on Scar. But then he got older. He's like, no, I am the king, right, of the promised land. I can do this. And he became brave. He went through a change. All right, a dynamic character goes through this change typically at the climax of the story. Now, typically they're the protagonist, but not always. Sometimes there are static characters. Now, static characters are characters that don't go through a change. Now, I don't want you to think that a static character means that it's not a good quality character and that they're not well-rounded. That's not true. Static characters are just as important to the story as the characters who go through some type of change. So characters that are really mean at the beginning of the story and then they turn really sweet and kind at the end, those characters, those dynamic characters, are just as important as the static characters who don't change. They never grow, they never develop. So, for example, think about Scar. Scar stays the same. He kind of stinks throughout the entire movie, right? But if you took static characters out, take that static character out of Lion King, take Scar out. What happens in the story? Well, there's not much of a story. So static characters are very important when you're looking at a text. Hold on, because our bell. Okay. Static characters are just as important when it comes to literary text as a dynamic character. Okay, they're just a little bit different. All right, and then you have tone. So tone is the attitude of a writer towards a subject or toward a specific audience. Okay, so kind of think about if you have a writer who is writing about, is writing to somebody that they love, right? One of the poems that I love to read is Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle into the Good Night. And it's a poem where he's urging his father, please do not die. I don't want you to die. Don't be ready for death. The tone of that text is how Dylan Thomas, who's the writer, feels about the fact that his dad is wanting to die. Well, he's angry. He's mad. He doesn't want his dad to die. So the tone is anger, desperation, longing. Please do not go gentle into the good night. So it's however the writer feels about the subject in which they are writing. Now, mood is the opposite. Mood is how we feel when we read a text. Do you read a text and you get super excited and happy? Well, that's the mood. Mood's happy. Go lightly. Do you read a text and you feel really sad or depressed, upset? That's the mood. Okay, so think about how the author is trying to make you feel. Sometimes I'll have students who they'll say, we'll read a poem and the mood is supposed to be funny. And they get to the end, they're like, this wasn't funny. Well, it was written in the 1800s. Humor's a little different. But what was the intended mood? Okay, what did the author intend for you to feel when you get done reading? That is the mood, okay? All right, next is imagery. This is something that you guys are probably very familiar with. Imagery is a pretty easy concept. It's just the type of figurative language that the author is using in order to get you to experience the five senses in the writing. So for example, what do you see when you are reading the words? Okay, what are you hearing? What do you taste? What are you feeling? All right, what do you smell? How are they describing those things? Okay, so for example, if they're saying that the sun is warm on my skin, that's a type of imagery because they're teaching you what something feels like. If somebody says, I could see the fog coming off of the dusty lake, well, what is that? Well, that's imagery. They're teaching you what a scene looks like. So authors use all five senses in order to kind of teach their reader what they're wanting them to experience when they're in a specific text. And you have symbolism. Okay, so symbolism typically is a harder concept for students to grasp but it's very simple. Symbolism is just when an author uses symbols in order to signify ideas or qualities. Okay, so think something easy. Okay, my wedding band. This is a ring, right? My husband bought this ring from a store. But what does this ring mean? This ring means that I am married. It's a symbol for my marriage. It's a symbol for me creating a family with my husband. This is not family. It represents a family. So look at the picture. The American flag. The American flag is not a country. What does it symbolize? Well, it symbolizes the United States of America. That's symbolism. If you're starting to drive yet, because I know some of you guys are starting to get your learner's permits, and you go to a stop sign, what is that? It's a symbol. Stop on the line. All right. There is not somebody manually saying you have to stop right here. It's a symbol for what action needs to occur. So symbolism is the same thing in a text. We'll work a lot more with symbolism, and I'll really help you guys through it when we come to those types of texts. But remember, it's not difficult. It can be pretty simple. Wait for my bells. All right, just a few more. So another thing, we have setting. Setting is typically a pretty easy concept for my students to remember. They're like, oh, it's just where something takes place. Yes, that is true. However, setting is also the time period. Time period is very, very important when it comes to setting. For example, if you're reading a short story, okay, about a guy that's in New York City, okay, how is that going to be different if the guy's in 2020 versus if he's in the 1920? Those are two very different stories because New York is very different during those times. So time period when it comes to setting is just as important as the actual place. So when I'm asking you about the setting of a story, I'm not just looking for the place. I'm also looking for the time period because time can really shed a lot of important information that the reader needs in order to fully understand the story. Okay, and then we have parallel structure. I'm going to skip this one because this one's a grammar concept, and we'll talk about that when we do our grammar review. All right, so close reading is something that we do a lot in this class, and this is when you basically read a text more than once. Okay, so you do a thorough rereading of a text in order to identify details, patterns, or deeper meanings. So I like to show my students this. Let me draw you something. So when I'm talking to my students about reading, I like to show them this image. Okay. And imagine this, I'm very good drawer, obviously. But imagine this is an iceberg, right? And this is the water. Icebergs at the top of the water are pretty small. And then at the bottom, that's when they get really big, right? That's what happened with the Titanic. They were like, oh, it's not a really big iceberg. And then they hit it at the bottom. It's the same concept with reading. When you read something the first time, you're at the top of the iceberg. You maybe can tell me the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. But you can't really tell me all of the why, right? That you can get at the end of this iceberg. You can only get to the bottom of the iceberg by reading a story multiple times. That's one reason why I try to pick smaller stories, so you're not having to reread a massive amount of text. Because a lot of times, the massive amount of text don't need rereading. A lot of times it's very small, short sections that the author is wanting you to reread, pay a little bit closer attention to. So when we're doing close reading, just know that you will be expected to read things more than once, sometimes twice, sometimes 18 times, okay? But the important thing is that you understand the reason why you do close readings. You do close readings to get to the bottom of the iceberg, okay? All right, context clues. Context clues are typically something that we use mostly for definitions, right? So context clues are just hints that an author gives to help define a difficult or unusual word, okay? So if I could say something like, let me think of a difficult word. I could say something like, the gymnast was a contortionist because she could bend her body's in different ways. Okay. You probably don't know what a contortionist is. A contortionist is just somebody that is very flexible. So even if you didn't know what the term contortionist means, you could probably have figured it out if you just waited and looked at the rest of the words. Well, what did I say? A gymnast. Okay, so what do gymnasts do? Well, they do a lot of flips, they do this, they stretch. And then what else did I say? That they bend their bodies. So gymnasts bend their bodies, contortionists. You could probably figure out the definition. This is a very, very important skill that we'll practice a lot in this class because this is something that's going to help you when you get out of high school. A lot of times you'll know, you'll think that you know the definition of a word, but you can't define it out loud. And this is really going to help you if you keep practicing this skill after you get out of high school, okay? Because it's something that all of us do, even adults use context clues almost every day, okay? All right, inferences. So inferences are something that every good reader has to do, especially now that you guys are in high school and you're reading more complex text. Okay, so inferences are when an audience or a reader reaches a conclusion about something from the known facts or evidence. Okay? This is when information was not directly told to you, but you could kind of infer this information, okay? We're going to talk a lot more about this when we're talking about types of conflict. But inferences, you guys do this all the time, kind of reading between the lines. So reaching a conclusion from the known facts. Objective summary, you guys will keep practicing this because it's such an important skill, but you guys have actually been doing this for a very long time. Just now that you are in high school, it's just going to look a little different because the text is going to look different. But an objective summary is just a brief statement or account of the main points of a text. So again, who, what, where, when, why. Now remember, objective summary is the top of the iceberg. Analysis is the bottom. All right, a central idea of a text is just the most important thought of a text, okay? So this is the who, what, where, when, where, why of a paragraph or of one stanza in a poem, okay? So it's what you're supposed to learn out of one comprehension section. Text structure. So text structure is how information is organized in a text, okay? So basically, when you're looking at text structure, there's a few different ways that you can look at it. Most of the times when a teacher is asking you about text structure, it's going to be about an informational text, okay? This will be a news article or a textbook or an interview, or there's something that's informational. There's something that's a true factual information. Because that's typically divided in a lot of different ways, like compare and contrast, chronological, cause and effect, problem and solution, things like that. When you're talking about text structure for a narrative or for a story, this is when you're doing the traditional plot diagram. Okay, so for example, imagine this, a lot of mountains today. At the beginning of your story, what is this called? All right, you have your exposition, the beginning of the story. And then the rising action, things are starting to get interesting. The climax of the story, falling action, resolution. This is something that you guys have probably done since elementary school, working on the little plot diagram. That's text structure. So how did they structure it? Was the climax really long? Or was it really short? Why did they make the climax shorter than the rising action? What was the purpose of that? That's what we do now that we're in high school. We look at the text structure, but we break it down and analyze it. Why did they make the exposition only 2 sentences, but the climax is 5 pages? What was the purpose? Why did they do that? That's what we're talking about when we're looking at text structure. All right, textual evidence, highly important in English 1. Okay, textual evidence is the evidence from a text, regardless of if it's fiction or nonfiction, that you can use to illustrate your ideas and support your arguments. Almost everything that you do for this class will require you to have textual evidence. Textual evidence is when you pull out a quote from the story or from the article and use that as your evidence. So for example, one of the first stories that we're going to be reading is Most Dangerous Game. So, Miss Dangerous Game, a question I can ask you is, how would you describe Rainsford's character? Cite your evidence. You could say Rainsford's character is brave. But what you need to do after you state that is you need to go back to the text and find me a quote that proves that Rainsford is brave. So you can say, for example, on line 54, Rainsford says, and then put in a quote that shows that he's being brave. That's textual evidence to prove your main point. Okay, we'll practice this a lot. All right, central idea we already talked about. Thesis statement we will save. And then that is all right. So I know that is a lot of information for you guys. So what I want you guys to do now with these is I want you to practice some of these concepts with a story that you already know. So it could be a story that you are already familiar with, or it can be a story that you just watched. It can be any type of story that you want. But I want you to put some of these into practice, okay? So log back into to Thrivus to get your assignment. Thanks, guys.